very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the generous invitation to come here and for the persistence also. And for the also equally generous and flattering introduction. Vladimir, indeed a good friend and esteemed colleague. I actually have a bit of a sentimental reason also to be here. Some time ago, let's say, in the late 20th century, I was a foreign exchange student in the state of Iowa, and so I'm actually happy to be back here in a different role a few years down the line. I am sorry to have lost, I think, the youngest part of the audience I've ever had. I hope you see me there. Yes. That puts more pressure on all of you to stay for the rest of the lecture, but thank you so much for being here on the Friday afternoon. My lecture consists of mainly two parts. I'm going to start with a relatively dense theoretical introduction that will outline the curatorial thinking behind the project that I co-curated with Anoma, Pieris, and Sean Anderson, and whose outcome was the exhibition that's been projected here on the screen for a while now. And I will then move on to a more sort of casual walkthrough through the exhibition and its structure, the different themes that we tried to highlight. So I'm hoping that the theoretical introduction, while it might be a little dense to listen to in the beginning, will become meaningful as we move on through the lecture and dive into the space of the exhibition. The project of independence was predicated on the notion that South Asia holds a unique place among the many regions of the world where modern architecture served both as an instrument and an active agent of social progress in the second half of the 20th century. Architects, planners, and engineers in the newly formed nation states of what had been British India and the Crown Colony of Ceylon, after the end of colonial rule in 1947-48, made a significant contribution to the political project of independence. Through their work, they articulated a powerful vision of self-determined post-colonial societies. This aspiration was expressed in new cities and spaces of political representation, and in the construction of formally and typologically innovative buildings. By responding to the social and material conditions on the ground, they asserted a cosmopolitan worldview that was uniquely situated in the subcontinent. In so doing, pioneering South Asian architects set in train processes that disrupted the colonial hierarchies of center and grid. France was presented for the first time to a wider audience in our exhibition and sourced from sometimes very arcane sources in the cellars of architect studios or in the cabinets of the widows or of the family members who were still around. And while several prominent South Asian architects have in recent years received monographic exhibitions, Krishna Doshi, of course, in particular, our exhibition was the first attempt to consider these architects' impressive and significant output within the ideological frameworks of its creation and the political context of the region as a whole. In her 2019 study, Worldmaking After Empire, the political scientist Evangelos Kotsioris, teaches at Princeton University, presents a powerful argument for understanding the political project of decolonization in the mid-20th century through a reconceptualization of which he calls, quote, anti-colonial nationalism as world-making. So, nationalism as world-making. While Kotsioris' study focuses on West Africa and on the Black Atlantic world and the sphere of international politics, we propose to translate this approach to the context of South Asian architecture. Such a move implies a practice of design and construction that speaks not only to the immediate needs of the newly founded nation states and their respective desires for self-representation through architecture, but also to the aspiration to be part of a larger international conversation about what it means to be modern. Hence, So we argue the construction of a new built environment was an important dimension of post-colonial cultural production that gained both aesthetic agency and symbolic meaning alike by aligning with political goals. Hence, we contend that in post-independent South Asia, modern architecture can and must be considered as a constitutive part of the process of post-colonial political and cultural equalization within a broader project of world-making that sought to create what Evangelos calls a, quote, egalitarian international order. Nationalism and cosmopolitanism, from this perspective, are not to be understood as mutually exclusive, but rather as interdependent forces that define the politics of decolonization in the global south, and specifically on the subcontinent. Our project thus intended to speak to the productive intellectual double bind between nationalism and internationalism. What the literary scholar Alpana Sharma has identified for some of the most prominent first-generation post-independence writers from the region, such as Rajanath or Attila Sein, is relevant for their architectural colleagues as well. I'm quoting Sharma, modernism is the natural idiom of these writers insofar as it provided them with a sharp-edged tool with which to chip away at the edifice of colonialism. Thus, while recent research across disciplines has powerfully asserted the degree to which modernity and colonialism were and are intertwined and unthinkable without each other, it is worth emphasizing also that modernity and modernism as its cultural articulation was also embraced as a powerful tool in the process of decolonization, not least through the ways in which it embodied and expressed the collective social aspirations of the region's newly independent nations. It was only consequential in this context that many architects turned away from British models of architectural pedagogy and versions of the modern, such as Art Deco, which had been widely used and popularized in the early centuries, such as Bombay, under colonial rule, or the incorporation of aspects of traditional monumental architecture in the colonial modern so-called Indo-Saracenic style, and instead looked to align themselves with a continental conception of modernism, often filtered through the so-called international style of the United States, but adapted to the very different economic, cultural, climatic, and technological situation in South Asia. Modern architecture in this light can be understood as serving as an instrument of cultural emancipation. And it is this notion of modernism as emancipation that, in fact, guided our exhibition. Emancipation not only from the weight of political and cultural colonization, but also from a rigid conception of modernism as uniquely developed by the West and considered from a Western perspective. Within this context, South Asian post-independence architecture stands in a specific relation to the concept of cosmopolitanism, which can be defined as ways of thinking, feeling, and acting beyond one's particular society, which has held center stage in post-colonial theory since its introduction by thinkers such as Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, or Arjun Upadhyaya. Related theories of cosmopolitics explored the situated and embodied character and complexity of cosmopolitanism, building on the work of a generation of post-colonial scholars who have opened up a new decentered point of view by considering the multiplicity and entanglements of modernist architecture and urbanisms. Wang Fenglu conceptualizes the, quote, distinctive meanings, practices, trajectories, transformations, and consequences of what he calls third world modernism. Lu writes, I'm quoting again, recognition of other modernities has to be posited at the level of epistemology in order to imagine an open globality based not on asymmetry and dominance, but on connectivity and dialogue on an equal basis. And in this spirit, our exhibition did not dwell at length with figures such as Le Corbusier or Vican, two seminal Western figures who have been celebrated many times previously for their bold contributions to architectural modernism in South Asia. Nor did we offer an expansive discussion of the main other foreign architects who were realizing projects in the region after political independence, among them figures such as Richard Neutra, Edward Durrell Stone, or Japan. Instead, we focused on significant projects of the first generation of South Asian post-independent architects, whether they were born in the region or settled there permanently. Many members of this generation trained in the West, and upon their return to the region, adapted and interrogated their education in addressing the social, economic, cultural, and material conditions on site, furthering the notion of a hybrid approach that speaks to both global and local frames of reference. While some of these efforts have in the past been judged harshly as having aligned too closely to Western precedents, our exhibition sought to demonstrate that these architects' highly reflective design processes were in fact shaped by two competing notions of identity. One anchored in a sense of transnational modernity, and the other rooted in the specificity of place. Thus, in a way, bridging the gap between world-making and nation-building. And it is in this tension between the universal and the specific, we argue, that the historical and aesthetic significance of the impressive body of work of the first generation of post-independent architects in South Asia is situated. So much for my brief, admittedly relatively dense, theoretical introduction. With that, I would like to now move to sort of a more visual stroke through the exhibition and give you sort of a brief overview of what it looked like and how it was structured. So here we have a view to the entrance of the galleries on the third floor, where the exhibition was located, and we see here the mounted this banner with this very sort of inspiring image that we found at the beginning of the exhibition, sort of this invitation for visitors and arouse their curiosity, and of course this very symbolic of this electricity pole that is being built up as part of this larger modernist infrastructure that speaks, that we felt speaks very well to the larger ambition of post-independent architecture on the subcontinent. Really, we pursued four main primary objectives with our exhibition, which I've tried to summarize here on this slide. First of all, and much of this is basically paraphrasing what I've already articulated earlier. First of all, to raise awareness for a body of work of extraordinary, we believe, historical and aesthetic significance from a region that played a seminal role in the global history of modernism and decolonization in the 20th century, so in this sense, a contribution to the national style of the United States, but adapted to the very different economic, cultural, climatic, and technological situation in South Asia. Modern architecture in this light can be understood as serving as an instrument of cultural emancipation. And it is this notion of modernism as emancipation that in fact guided our exhibition. Emancipation not only from the weight of political and cultural colonization, but also from a rigid conception of modernism as uniquely developed by the West and considered from a Western perspective. Within this context, South Asian post-independence architecture stands in a specific relation to the concept of cosmopolitanism, which can be defined as ways of thinking, feeling, and acting beyond one's particular society, which has held center stage in post-colonial theory since its introduction by thinkers such as Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, or Arjun Appadurai. Related theories of cosmopolitics explored the situated and embodied character of and complexity of cosmopolitanism. Building on the work of a generation of post-colonial scholars
who have opened up new decentered points of view by considering the multiplicity and entanglements of modernist architecture and urbanisms. Duangfeng Lu conceptualizes the, quote, distinctive meanings, practices, trajectories, transformations, and consequences of what she calls third world modernism. Lu writes, and I'm quoting again, recognition of other modernities has to be posited at the level of epistemology in order to imagine an open globality based not on asymmetry and dominance, but on connectivity and dialogue on an equal basis, end quote. And in this spirit, our exhibition did not dwell at length on figures such as Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn, the two seminal Western figures who have been celebrated many times previously for their bold contributions to architectural modernism in South Asia. Nor did we offer an expansive discussion of the many other foreign architects who were realizing projects in the region after political independence, among them figures such as Richard Neutra, Edward Durrell Stone, or Joe Bonti. Instead, we focused on significant projects of the first generation of South Asian post-independence architects who either were born in the region or settled there permanently. Many members of this generation trained in the West, and upon their return to the region adapted and interrogated their education in addressing the social, economic, cultural, and material conditions on site, furthering the notion of a hybrid approach that speaks to both global and local frames of reference. While some of these efforts have in the past been judged harshly as having aligned too closely to Western precedents, our exhibition sought to demonstrate that these architects' highly reflective design processes were in fact shaped by two competing notions of identity, one anchored in a sense of transnational modernity and the other rooted in the specificity of place. Thus, in a way, bridging the gap between world-making and nation-building. And it is in this tension between the universal and the specific, we argue, that the historical and aesthetic significance of the impressive body of work that the first generation of post-independence architects in South Asia is situated. So much for my brief, admittedly relatively dense theoretical introduction. And with that, I would like to now move to sort of a more leisurely stroll through the exhibition and give you sort of a brief overview of what it looked like and how it was structured. So here we have a view to the entrance of the galleries on the 3 North, on the 3rd floor where the exhibition was located, and we see here sort of we mounted this banner with this very sort of inspiring image that we found at the beginning of the exhibition, sort of as an invitation for visitors and arouse their curiosity, and of course this very symbolic meaning of this electricity pole that is being built up as the part of this larger modernist infrastructure that we felt speaks very well to the larger ambition of post-independence architecture on the subcontinent. Really, we pursued 4 main primary objectives with our exhibition, which I've tried to summarize here on this slide. First of all, and much of this is basically a paraphrase of what I've already articulated earlier. First of all, to raise awareness for a body of work of extraordinary, we believe, historical and aesthetic significance from a region that played a seminal role in the global history of modernism and decolonization in the 20th century, so in this sense,
to a global history of architecture. Then, directly related to that, the second point that we were trying to make, to challenge received notions of the canon of architectural history, said not least by institutions such as MoMA itself. This is also sort of a self-critical assessment of the institutional history of MoMA and sort of an attempt to think beyond what has been done in the past to readdressing of aspects of architectural history in the 20th century that have been left out of of the narratives as they have been presented by MoMA and other institutions. Thirdly, to raise awareness for the endangered status of many of these buildings that many of these buildings find themselves in, and in so doing contributing toward heritage preservation of the monuments of the post-independence era. That's of course sort of a very ambitious goal. I don't think that exhibitions have the power to directly change policies about heritage preservation, but at least they can contribute to an awareness again of the historical and architectural significance of many of these buildings. Many of them have fallen into disrepair or are no longer in use, which of course makes it very, very difficult to maintain them, which is particularly tragic because they really are monuments to this great societal aspiration of newly independent countries after independence in the subcontinent. And then, of course, to explore how a first generation of post-independence architects in South Asia situated modernism, universalist modernism in the subcontinent's specific economic and cultural conditions, as well as its material and craft culture. Which brings us to the question of labor, which is something that we addressed throughout the exhibition in various instances. And so the first of the 6 chapters, thematic chapters of the exhibition, was entitled New Cities. So it took sort of this very broad approach to how in the post-independence period, not least because of the massive refugee influx of refugees on both sides of the border, Pakistan on the one hand and India on the other, and there was the need for massive housing of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire new cities had to be constructed and built from scratch. The violent partition of 1947 redrew borders across the subcontinent, establishing new and often fraught boundaries between nations and leading to a prolonged humanitarian crisis, displacement and bloodshed. To absorb the arrival of unprecedented numbers of refugees, some existing cities dramatically expanded and unfolded: New Delhi, Bombay, Karachi, Dhaka, and so on, while elsewhere new ones were created. City construction began soon after independence and continued at pace, in the process articulating political divisions between India and Pakistan. The foundation of Chandigarh, the Indian state capital of the now divided Punjab region, symbolized the political and economic aspirations of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who saw the city as a laboratory for his secular vision of modernization and industrialization. And in Pakistan, the establishment of Islamabad as the country's capital spurred bold construction projects for the master planned city. In contrast to these early cities, the southern Indian experimental town of Auroville, founded 2 decades after independence, embodied the vision of universal humanity espoused by independence movement leader and the techno yogi guru Sri Aurobindo. So indeed, we started with this image that I've already discussed in the new cities section, and then moving on to a video by the Swiss filmmaker Alain Tanner, who actually just passed away last week, in which he shows us an aspect of Chandigarh, which is relatively little known, namely how the city was actually constructed. What the whole technological apparatus, or the pre-technological apparatus, one could say, that formed the base of the construction of Chandigarh. We're of course all very familiar with Chandigarh as this bold sort of urbanist project, really one of the great new city building projects of the 20th century. Besides Brasilia and Vladimir would argue New Belgrade. And it is astounding that this sort of aspirational city of the future was built with
builders who built the city and are still building it are the only people of the city who do not live in it. They live in settlements outside. A rupee in Chandigarh is worth about 1 6
Coming out of Chandigarh, one of the Indian architects who worked with the team of Le Corbusier and all the other architects, would develop his own urbanist vision. Here, his linear city, which takes on the cue from Chandigarh, but tries to adopt it to the more specific ways of living in India. By obviously adopting an absolutely modernist vision of the city that could potentially be expanded at infinitum towards the horizon, but that would situate or give space to traditional ways of living in cities by creating impromptu sites for markets, for all kinds of interaction at these streets. Then I've briefly mentioned before, here a model of a city, again, another utopian project for a city in the south of India. This project by the French architect Angers for Auroville, a city that was sort of devised for a spiritual community. It does exist, not quite to the scale of several tens of thousands of people who are supposed to be living here, but currently about 2,000 or 3,000 people in this experimental community, and it's still sort of in the process of emergence, although with a different master plan in place. We're able to source this model, and this beautiful, spectacular model of the city in the form of a galaxy directly from Auroville, so really one of the spectacular highlights of our exhibition. And then, of course, I mentioned housing. Housing is a very important aspect of this construction of new cities here. Charles Correa's Bellapur housing project represented a very beautiful drawing. And then also this photograph here, which gives us an understanding this notion of participatory design that really, only gives people sort of a very simple box to work with, and then potentially, incrementally build on and expand according to the specific needs of a family or whoever is in these places. These kind of incremental self-help models were widely popular throughout the subcontinent, partly also supported by the United Nations, but also by governments in these countries. The second section was entitled Templates for Living, and it directly relates to the New Cities, chapter, but is now more specifically focused on housing. Again, in direct relationship also to the problem of partition, to trauma partition, and the need to house hundreds of thousands of refugees on those sides of the border. We were able to include, luckily, here also a section on Sri Lankan woman, architect Denise Silva, who is really the mother of modern architecture in Sri Lanka. Jeffrey Bawa is sort of the household name. Everybody thinks of Jeffrey Bawa when we talk about modernism or modern architecture in Sri Lanka. Denise Silva actually was his teacher, and he worked for her for a while. She was a very prominent figure, and she was a member of the SIAM, the only actual representative of South Asia in the SIAM. She was very good terms with the Corbusier. Some of her letters that she exchanged with the Corbusier from her time in SIAM. She was also a prolific writer and an important educator who taught at the University of Hong Kong for a while. But most importantly, she really brought a modernist idiom to Ceylon, building mainly houses for the newly forming middle class in her hometown of Kandy, former capital city of Sri Lanka. She really used these houses as sort of laboratories to experiment with modernist formal language, but also by trying to adopt this modernism to the specific climatic and cultural conditions. And in fact, she published a very important article in 1951, together with the completion presentation of her first house, where she made an argument that modernism needs to in Sri Lanka needs to adopt to the tropical climate that is being built in. Many of these houses are now in museums, have been destroyed or have been altered to the point that they're hardly recognizable anymore. We're extremely lucky to be able to source these original photographs, which have been given by Minette de Silva to a professor at Penn State University a few years ago. And this in the context of the fact that the entire archive in Venice was completely lost. There are no original drawings remaining, or models for that matter. So we're particularly happy to be able to represent that to a larger audience for the first time. Another important woman architect working in the subcontinent who was also very engaged with the question of housing, Yasmin Nari, one of the prominent figures of Pakistani modernism, which is particularly interesting, given that we're talking about an Islamic country here. Yasmin Lari's claim to fame is the Anguri Bagh housing for very, very poor refugees who came across the border to Lahore, which becomes the traditional capital city of the Punjab, which ended up on the Pakistani side after a partition, and Yasmin Lari won the Khan Award for this important housing project, and she has actually continued to work in humanitarian efforts to the present day, working along with displaced people throughout Pakistan. Really an extraordinary figure for our attention. Another very important, interesting aspect we try to highlight in this housing section is Living Asian Games Village, a wonderful project by the New Delhi-based architect Roger Wall. This Asian Games Village was devised, as you might guess, as to house the athletes of the Asian Games, which is the Asian Olympics. And very early in 1982, already with the idea to then further use this temporary housing for athletes to form a new city neighborhood, which has actually in this case worked very, very successfully, and this is this Asian Games Village is now it's a very sought after popular place to live, a very leafy neighborhood there. So a very successful sort of project in this matter. What also is interesting about the Asian Games Village that it is based on a sort of historical investigation of traditional urbanism in India. Here, Jaisalmer, these studies were made by Roger Wall and his team, and this historical investigation into traditional ways of living, the intersection of public and private spaces, with these rooftop terraces, which are so prominent features of many cities in North India, would then sort of transformed into this modernist adaptation of the Asian Games Village. I'm showing you another brief video of the Gold Coast, which is actually
located in Pondicherry, on the southeast coast of India, was designed by Antonin and George Nakashima in 1935 as a multi-story dormitory of Sri Aurobindo's ashram.
This building has a world stature, architecturally and in its bioclimatic response to a tropical, warm and humid climate. It has the reputation of being a well-maintained, comfortable building, although it has no mechanical cooling system. While gaining from the practical experience acquired in the vernacular buildings of Pondicherry, the architects have tried to translate them into materials that are offered by the modern world. The local climatic conditions were taken into consideration, and the building was given the most logical shape dictated by the local conditions. It is an exposed, reinforced concrete frame structure with traditional lime plaster on the brick walls. The fundamental principles of architecture, simplicity, economy, beauty, and closeness to nature were consciously and consistently observed. Golconda is truly timeless in its essence and a masterpiece of architecture. The roof is made of large and thin precast curved cement concrete elements, creating a ventilated airspace over the third floor concrete slab. The ends of these precast curved elements on the north and south are sealed with perforated concrete slabs. The double roof was important because of the almost continuous intense heat of the tropics. The convection of air keeps the top floor rooms almost as cool as the ones below. Both north and south facades are fully openable with louvers, which can be fully opened, half opened, or closed by a series of simple state-of-the-art brass bars with notches to adjust the angles. Interestingly, all along the north facade, there is first the corridor which connects all the rooms. The decision to keep the corridor in the north side is an important one, since Golconda is situated on 12-degree north latitude with summer sun penetrating on the north. This is how the rooms are kept all the year round, even in the hot weather. The louvers are easy to operate individually and allow for personal preferences. Rooms are separated from corridor by wooden sliding doors that allow air to circulate freely when open. The walls of the rooms are of brickwork, covered with seashell-lined plaster. There is no need to paint these walls, and they retain their hygroscopic quality even after 85 years. The landscape gardens on the south and north have a sense of wideness due to the angle given to the building. Enclosed on all sides by high walls, they become peaceful cloisters where one can walk and relax. The simple landscaping of the surrounding garden, with its trees and grass and shallow pools, carries out the effect of coolness that is realized structurally in the building itself. The high protecting wall holds in the air that is cooled by the attractively landscaped garden and keeps out the heat of the surrounding heat islands of unshaded streets. To further the cooling current of air in summer, as often there is no movement of air at all. The garden on the northern side of the building was left rather bare, whereas the garden space available in the southern side was planted with many trees and shrubs. By these means, the rooms at Golco are always cool and did not require any mechanical ventilation. The rooms are provided with a ceiling lamp for general lighting and a desktop lamp for task lighting. They were initially not even equipped with ceiling or table fans for ventilation. But over the years, construction activities around the town and hard surfaces have contributed to urban heat island effects. As a result, some rooms are provided with table fans used for personal cooling only when it is really necessary. In articulating an unambiguous stance towards minimal resource consumption and bioclimatic architecture, the building champions a unique aesthetic. The story of Golco's dormitory, in both design and construction, remains quintessentially international. Having outlived its designers, it celebrates their ideals of a progressive vernacular modernism, simultaneously resonant in the local and global context.
Yes, so I think all the important things have been said already about this building. You will have noticed that it was constructed in the late 1930s before, so it actually is a building that predates independence. We felt it important to include because it in many ways serves as a model for how to adopt modernism on the subcontinent, but also for very contemporary conversations about the bioclimatic design that's also relevant in our age of the climate catastrophe. With that, we're moving to the third section, which was entitled Industry and Infrastructure, and so obviously it deals with all kinds of factories, in industrial production sites, but also with industrialization of agriculture. Here in the foreground, a beautiful model, a dairy factory, project by the Delhi-based architect Architecture project that really stood for what became known in India as the White Revolution, and the government decided that every child should have daily access to milk, and so they used a pre-existing co-op system of sort of small-scale farms that had established this co-op in the northeast of the country in order to sort of use that model and apply it throughout the entire country. And we did not have an original model of this project, and for this reason commissioned students of the Cooper Union to design this model for us, together with 5 other newly designed models, and they were wonderful anchors in the exhibition, and really helped our audiences understand the spatial complexity, but also the architectural significance of many of these buildings. The Union, by the way, was already our partner in crime for the Yugoslavia exhibition, where we worked with designed models to showcase some of the important projects where we look like original models. Another building in this section was called is the Steel Corporation Office and Housing in Orihuela, near the administrative headquarters of this National Steel Corporation, which is built in a moment of great economic distress. The absence of steel and lack of ability or the inability to import led to the fact that, paradoxically, this building for the steel mill was actually designed to prefabricated concrete. And interestingly, we also found the items of Tinian, which of course was very much promoting industrialization on a rapid scale within a socialist context that Sri Lanka adopted for a while in the 60s and 70s. We also included the whole tourism sector in industry and infrastructure. It might be surprising, but it is a fact that tourism was particularly for Sri Lanka rapidly became the most important industry source of income. And we were able to present, among other things, a truly spectacular hotel project, the Tongal Bay Hotel, by another quite unknown Sri Lankan architect by the name of Valentine Sekra, whose career was a staunch modernist, whose career was kind of cut short in Sri Lanka because his modernist beliefs fell out of favor with his anti-indigenous discourses in architecture, and Jeffrey Bauer. He was then moved to California, where he ended his career in the Sacramento area, where his family still lives, so we were able to source some materials for our exhibition. Then also, of course, factories here, a fantastic factory for scooters by Joseph Al Stein, a California architect who actually moved to New Delhi and built his career there, and here and factory. The political spaces sort of is the fourth chapter was the fourth chapter of the exhibition. It held center stage, was the first thing we saw, and we put a center stage here in the foreground, this beautiful model of the Hall of Nations, which is built on the occasion of the 1972 International Trade Fair in New Delhi, and besides the model and an absolutely spectacular perspective drawing there in the background on the we again had a video of the construction of this building, and I just want to show you a brief clip from his construction site, which again I think is really incredibly interesting to see how this concrete space frame was built on site. This whole idea of building this massive complex of buildings on-site concrete was predicated again by the fact that there was no steel available, it was too expensive, and that in fact it was cheaper because of the ready availability of very cheap labor to pour each of the elements of this building on site, as opposed to using prefabrication as would have been done in the West. So we have here an incredible sort of source of engineering ingenuity, which was only possible because of the specific economic conditions in South Asia that simply would not have been possible anywhere else in the world at that time. I'm going to cut this short here because I also want to leave a bit of time for a conversation afterwards. Of course, photographs are included, and there's some beautiful, designs, drawings by the architect. The interior of this building, which was very shamefully torn down in 2017, and is no longer here, so it was probably the most individual monument to this post-independence spirit event on the concrete anniversary of 1972. Political space, of course, also includes the Parliament's masterful Parliament building. Again, we tried not to focus so much on the building itself, but instead showed a very beautiful, very large-scale photo montage of the construction site, where you can study, how the use of expanded scaffolding was put, onto this gigantic scale of this capital complex in the capital city of what will become Bangladesh. And then the last two sections of the exhibition dealt with institution building. The first part we called landscapes of education. And the notion was here, or the idea was here, that these newly independent nation states had to build citizens that would maintain the institutions and also the apparatus that was necessary for an independent and self-determined nation. And we have to keep in mind that it was, for example, impossible to study architecture or medicine or the law, for that matter, in the subcontinent during British rule. So when you were born in India and had the needs, you would be sent to Britain to receive your higher education. Of course, the newly independent nations had a strong interest in changing that, which means that there was a heavy investment in construction of universities, school, places of higher learning, entire university campuses, and so on and so forth. And one of the more interesting projects is here in Bangladesh, a series of new universities, shown here, absolutely beautiful master plan for Chittagong University in south of Bangladesh by Martino Stierli, who is the father of modernism in his home country. And you see this beautiful overlay of the pre-existing riverine landscape that is so characteristic of Bangladesh, with this abstract geometric order that he superimposes over the pre-existing landscapes and nestles individual classrooms and dormitories and so on into that landscape. On the right, an image representing one of the dormitories. We were often asked, is this a ruin? No, it's not. You'll see that there are some clotheslines there, so students are actually living in these buildings. It's also, of course, however, very telling for the impact of the climate on these modernist structures. The set, founded by Balkrishna Doshi in the late 60s, probably to the present day, the most important school of architecture in the subcontinent, with definitely an international presence. In Ahmedabad, which is also one of the centers of modernism in the period, we have a beautiful original model from Doshi's office of view in our galleries. And then finally another later project by Balkrishna Doshi in Bangalore, the Indian Institute of Management, the preeminent school of economics in the country, with a absolutely gorgeous campus, very, very complex and large compound that is characterized by these really beautiful spaces, these covered spaces, semi-open spaces that negotiate between the classrooms and the natural landscape around. And then finally, the last section of the exhibition, institution building on a larger scale, that includes buildings for religion, for sports stadiums, all kinds of cultural pathologies, and so on and so forth. Here in the foreground, actually only religious building that we included a mosque for Islamabad, capital city of Pakistan, again with a beautiful newly designed model by the students from the Cooper Union, but with a couple of beautiful also original drawings from architect Anwar Said, who was responsible for many of the mosques that were built in Islamabad after its being founded. Again, Doshi, the Institute of Indology in Ahmedabad, which was one of its earliest contributions as an independent architect, having worked both for Le Corbusier and Kahn for several years here, both in the desert his independence as a talented architect that of course when he quickly rise years ago. Here again, one of the mosques like Anwar Said, and then finally Joseph Alvin Steiner already mentioned the cultural center in South in New Delhi. And I think at this point I should probably stop.
For a few more.
Okay, a few more minutes. I just wanted to maybe summarize what we tried to do with the exhibition. So we have the 6 thematic sections. We tried as always to include a number of different media in the exhibition. It's difficult to represent buildings in a gallery space. We always have to work with representations. So models, of course, serve a very important purpose. We try to, as much as possible, to rely on original models where that is not possible. We commissioned new models from the students, the very talented students from the Cooper Union. We, of course, relied heavily on original drawings and sketches and perspectives and so on. From the architects, very possible, all kinds of archival photographs that we sourced from many, many places. But then, of course, also the moving image, which I think tried to indicate. Moving image, of course, particularly popular with our audience because it allows, non-architects probably the best way to understand how a building is organized and how it feels to move through a space. Like in previous exhibitions, we also commissioned a local photographer around here, Singh in this case, to re-photograph many of the buildings that we were interested in, really to give an understanding to our audiences how these buildings have been appropriated, become part of everyday life for some people in the subcontinent, how they've been changed, how they've been added on, but also how they have sometimes been preserved almost in their original state. And then finally, just a quick overview of the catalog. The exhibition, of course, is a very temporary medium that is only on view for a few months. What remains is, of course, the catalog. As a scholar myself, I'm very interested in using the catalog not only as a representation of what's in an exhibition, but in fact, really using it as a way to create new scholarship around the topic at hand. We do this, here is a table of content by giving voice to a number of authors, really the idea of polyphony. We have people, particularly scholars from the region, talking about specific aspects of the built environment in a number of thematic essays that are complemented by 2 large essays by us curators. We're talking about the politics of concrete, and another Pieris talking about institutional building in South Asia. Catalog, of course, also houses a very ample, beautiful portfolio with some of the images that are on here seeing brought back from his excursions to many of the buildings, and that he was able to see the thematic essays here on infrastructure ministry by Alex Rivastava and Prescriber, another one by Salomon Kaur on design in South Asia. And then finally complemented by a selection of 15 particularly important individual buildings or projects that are highlighted through a very short essay, but with ample illustrations here at the they'll be about Kulić or Final of Islam. And now, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Martino. We have about 17 minutes, I think, or maybe let's say 20, for questions from the audience. I'm actually going to abuse my position here as public comment of MC. Especially ask you with the first question, because when we worked on the Yugoslavia show, one of the big challenges was acquiring the archival material for an exhibition at a major museum of art, where actually having access to original drawings, photos, models, etc. is essential. And there were several moments for me when we, for example, in Sarajevo, ended up finding the parts of the archival, and I chart that I never thought I would see in my life, that almost drew me to tears. I remember that moment as being one of the absolute highlights of the process. What was the biggest surprise in terms of finding the materials during the preparation of this iteration?
It's a good question. I don't have an easy answer to that. I would say if the Yugoslavia project was complex in sourcing original materials, the South Asian project was infinitely more complex, which is also the reason why I really worked on this project for probably about 6 years. Of course, not full time, but it was a very long time in the making, and we've made many trips to a part of the world where there is not really much of an institutional setting for housing architectural drawings or originals anywhere. So it really meant identifying the architects and trying to see are their offices still around, are there families that might have original materials. So it was really sort of talking to a lot of people and trying to find what we could, and that was very often not successful, which is why so many things that we would hope to we couldn't represent. I mean, for me personally, one of the big surprises was the visits to the architect Akut Kanvinde's office. Kanvinde passed away probably about 20 years, still a daily-based architect, one of the fathers of modernism in India. His office, however, is still around, run by his son and daughter-in-law. And what we found there was really an absolute, incredible wealth of original materials, a truly unsung hero of modernism, and we were lucky enough to include some of this material in our exhibition. I'm very, very thankful for that.
Thank you.
I think I will need a microphone.
Okay.
You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have plenty of practice in this room immediately. My question is more regarding the title of the exhibition and the approach, also the institution. Like recently we've been working with the Charles James Foundation, trying to figure out what's the difference between the diagrams they did, Charles James did, and the diagrams that Alfred Barr did at the beginning of the 20th century, right, where he was trying to catalog all these abstractions. And then we came to the conclusion that that's what modernism does. It's like a process of abstraction, abstraction of labor, abstraction of extraction, abstraction of imperialism and globalization. And the question is more regarding how does an institution that has a very clear ideological stance when it comes to modernity, like the idea of modernity from the kind of, I would say, egocentric standpoint, where it is a certain type of architecture, it's based on the roots, as we mentioned, like the Siam, the Corbusier, the project of the modern movement. And how does that reconcile with the idea of decolonization as not only the returning of the land to the process of sovereignty and independence, but also with political practices that may be really different than the ones of the West, right? Because in the case that all these buildings are somehow considered through the lens of what we understand as modern that comes from that catalog? Is there space also for reflection of architectures that may be at odds with this, that maybe not, they are modern in the way that they are proposing a new way of sovereignty, but that they don't subscribe to the catalog of Le Corbusier modernism or Chandigarh, right? Of the aesthetics that are so easily recognizable to us, you know, the Pilotis and the Gris Soleil and all that. Is there space for that type of reflection, right? That maybe also goes against the institutionalization of aesthetics, right? Because most of these are universities. Many of them are actually teaching modernist practices in architecture. You know, in the case of the legacy of Correa and all the other sort of Indian architects that are very Le Corbusian, so to speak, right? Is there space for that reflection, or is it clearly just based on the model of a certain type of aesthetics in the project? And at the end of the day, is it really about decolonization, or something that is more legible to us as progress in that process?
Wow. It's probably about 70 questions. And I'm going to try to answer two things. The first one is, I think what your question implies is the idea that modernism was somehow imposed on South Asia after independence by the West, by the Western architects who got an opportunity to build there, perhaps also by the governments that were representing or not their, you know, newly formed nations, many of which, of course, had a very problematic sort of relationship to the notion of nation in the first place, you know, partition. What we tried to argue was a little bit contrary. We really tried to show that no, it was actually the first generation of South Asian architects who embraced a specific notion of modernity, which of course had a relationship to what others had done in the West, but that they appropriated and, you know, transformed into something they owned by addressing the specific economic, labor, cultural conditions on the site. And I've tried to illustrate that here through a couple of examples. For example, the Hall of Nations, which say that this is a building or an aesthetic that is imposed or comes from elsewhere is not true. It actually, the design of this building could only have happened in the specific you know, conditions of South Asia at that moment, because of the fact that there was no steel available, because of the fact that labor was so cheap, and so on and so forth. And so I think that is really, I think it was, you know, very important for us to foreground that yes, modernity and colonialism do go hand in hand. We know that. But it is also worth underlining and emphasizing that for these people in the period of post-independence, modernity also was a powerful tool of emancipation and decolonization. And I think this ambiguity is really interesting to think about what it means, you know, what modernism means, and you know, in its various aspects. And then the question, is there a space for an aesthetic that is not, you know, so strongly predicated by Le Corbusier and Kalt? I would say yes. We have, for example, a section on Laurie Baker, who I didn't talk about. He was a British-born architect, but moved to India very early and spent the rest of his life there, became a citizen. And he, you know, worked very much with local people on very, very simple brick houses. He actually built thousands of houses for relatively modest clients, and you know, he tried to adopt specific construction techniques that were around and that were useful. So yes, I would answer that question. Yes.
Okay, let's go from left to right.
How diverse was the research team for this project? Was it the kind of thing where you were able to get a lot of, like, where you were able to involve people who were born or who were raised or lived in the areas that you were focused on, or was it more just kind of very white, like people critiquing and looking at these South Asian architecture, which is still based on South Asian?
It's a very good question. No, and obviously, I would never undertake a project like this without, the expertise of people from the region. So Anoma Pieris, wanted to have her as my co-curator. Sri Lankan forward teaches at the University of Melbourne, one of the preeminent thinkers of post-colonialism in South Asia. But besides that, we assembled an advisory board of probably about 20 people. They're all acknowledged in the credits. Most of them are scholars originally from the region, many of them, of course, work in the West. And many of them, as I mentioned, contributed to the catalog with thematic essays, which was really important for us to, underscore this. That not only the curators of the exhibition have this authoritative position of knowledge and power, but that many people have a voice in this
So my question is very similar to the first one, and you covered a lot of the basis for it, but I was wondering if the sort of the post-colonial independence is a decolonization of authority, or is that the same thing as the decolonization of ideology? And political and economic theory aside, does that decolonization spur nationalism or globalism? Like, or a nationalist or globalist ideology within those nations?
The first part of the question I can't answer because I'm an architectural historian. But I did, of course, reference in the theoretical introduction this, for me, very inspiring book by a political scientist, Herbert, which, argues, as I mentioned, in the context of independence in West Africa. And what I found so inspiring about this book is that she makes the point that nationalism and cosmopolitanism or internationalism were actually not opposing forces, but reinforcing each other. So many of these, African, first generation African independence thinking were making the point, we want to create a pan-African unity. Well, that is only possible by first establishing our nationhood. And I found that a really, interesting, worthwhile tool, not only for us to think in the context of architectural production in South Asia, which I think is also, relating to both these poles, trying to be an equal partner in an international conversation about what is modern, while at the same time defining a specific South Asian approach to architecture. And by the way, I find the approach also interesting in our own, presence of internationalism.
Hi, I'm just curious. So you had said that this took about 6 years to collect all the information. What would the average time be for collecting all of this stuff for an exhibition, and how do you know when you're actually done?
You're never done. You just have to, at some point the exhibition is on the calendar and then you just have to go. It's a good question. I can't give you an answer. It really depends on, what kind of project you're working on. There's collection, installation, collection, exhibitions where we draw exclusively or predominantly from things that are already in the collection of the museum. That's much easier. We don't have to work as long. We don't have to source material. But here, obviously, in these larger research projects we had here, we is to find materials that have not been exhibited. And sometimes we also try to, the hope is also that we can collect and make them, make some of these materials part of the collection, which is in itself a kind of complicated conversation. But I believe in this because I think the collection is the lasting legacy of any curator, and I think you can't change the Eurocentric worldview that MoMA and other institutions have pursued for so many decades without changing. It's very fundamental, just a collection. So that's not actually an answer to your question, but I think the so.
Hi, up here. It's related to this last question, actually. I always thought of the setting up of an exhibition as a research project. So when you start, you probably have some concepts that you want to develop or some ideas for where the results of the exhibition will arrive or will go. So I'm just curious of knowing if there was some result that was completely unexpected for you, or if you do not have any expectations at the beginning, and so the result was like a huge discovery.
I think any project starts, needs to start with an open mind and exploratory way of working. But at some point, then it becomes important to form, a methodological approach, an idea, a concept. In this case, the question: how does the desire for political emancipation and self-determination reflect on architectural production? Because that's a very specific way of looking at a problem that I'm particularly interested in, this intersection of architectural production and politics. And of course, one would have done 15 other shows with very different approaches. So, this is very much, a curatorial position that can be criticized, that can be questioned. It's the one I believe in, it's the one that Anoma and Sean believed in, and we felt it was important. But it's one of the main stories. And of course, that means also it's one, that many things were not presented. So, curation is discrimination. We decide what goes in and what doesn't. So, it's in itself politics of exclusion, if you want to call it.
Faiz, one last question because we are running out of time. So, Faiz, please.
My question is regarding the term South Asian architecture. It is an umbrella term for a lot of countries that are similar, but very unique in their own way. Do you think that it's an opportunity, it's also like an opportunity to lose a lot of this uniqueness in architecture between these countries? Because this term is thrown a lot in academia, at least I see that South Asian architecture, and then sort of like painting them with one brush. But do you think this exhibition also points out the uniqueness and the special quality of architecture that's done in India, to Pakistan, to Bangladesh? There was a margin for that as well.
Yeah. The answer is no. Yes, these are very different countries in the end, and it became more different over time. And of course, they would also develop their specific aspects of architecture and architectural modernism. Though I'm not sure one could say there's a national style of modernism in Pakistan. This in India, I don't think actually that is the case. We made the assertion that we want to consider this as a shared cultural space because of the shared colonial history, because of the shared moment of independence, and because of the shared need to address all these problems that came out of this moment of independence and the trauma of partition. Which is not to say that the countries were